Hey guys, Werfs here. So this is a new series that I guess I'm starting. I want to take a look at the terms that the community uses a lot and that they throw around, and I want to dissect and determine why they use those words that they do and how the gameplay mechanics reflect uh, the definitions. So today we're going to be talking about OP cards, cards that are considered overpowered. Now, what how do we define overpowered and what is overpowered categorized into? So there's three categories for overpowered. Number one, there is mana manipulation, direct mana manipulation using cards to directly influence how much mana you're gaining that turn or the next few over the next few turns, with as little interactivity with your opponent as possible. Efficient spells, whether it be removal, burn damage, anything offensive that is also very, very well priced. And of course, overstated creatures. Creatures that have high stats and are meant to come with a drawback, but in the long run, it usually doesn't. So, for the first one, mana manipulation, a few cards come into mind. Ogre Dance from the red color, Kalim's Prayer, the infamous Kalim's Prayer from yellow, and of course the Windfall from blue. So these three cards, as you can see, directly influence how much mana you're getting and also directly manipulate how much you can spend this turn, all without opponent interactivity. Ogre Dance is a 4 mana gain 7. So in net gain, you're gaining 3, assuming you get maximum value. Kalim's Prayer, you gain 2, and but you can only activate it when you attack a god, but you also draw a card. Windfall is a 10 gain 12, which effectively gains you 2 mana, so it's kind of a worse Kalim's Prayer in most cases. So in terms of efficient removal, now everyone has their gripes, but for sure red has the most efficient removal with burn. Flame Burst, Cypher's Wrath. In Furia, burn damage is very, very important in the sense that uh both players only start with 20 health and they can't go above that. Whereas in Hearthstone, you start with 30, the game is a little bit slower, and you can have armor gain to go above the cap. In Furia, there's very little healing and pretty much no armor gain or anything of the sort where you can max out over your health. So in that sense, burn damage is actually very reliable, and to have removal bundled with burn damage at such a low cost is considered very strong. Not only these cards are considered OP, but definitely see Flameburst getting enough, hate and opinions on the Discord and subreddit enough to warrant that, maybe Flameburst could be balanced a little bit better. I'm not going to give any input because I'm not very good at balancing cards, but there's definitely gripes about Flame Burst being borderline broken. And next we have the yellow package. Yellow is known for their removal, and rush obviously, but everything in here is just so mana efficient. Choking Sands, 4 mana, destroy a creature with 3 attack or less. So while most of the time you might be trading 1-to-1 with it with even mana cost, Wood Elemental Grim Guards, there are also times where Choking Sands gets you a huge advantage if you kill a King or Queen's Guard, Shadim Brute, a what do you call it? The 1/7 taunt from the green, even if it's been buffed by Elderwood Embrace. You know, Choking Sands can get rid of it very, very quickly. And for 2 mana more and 1 land more, you have Last Nightmare, which is arguably the best removal in the game. So not only it destroys a creature just without any side effects, no consequences. Just 6 mana, destroy something you don't see fit being on the board. Wind Soldier with the haste and charge 3 allows it to collect twice, assuming you have board position, where in the mid and late game you definitely will. Essentially turning it into a 2 mana 3 damage or even a 1 mana 3 damage creature. Sojourn, obviously, similar to Cypher's Wrath, kind of does the opposite. Instead of dealing damage to the enemy's uh, orb, you gain health. But in the end, direct damage in spells always wins out. So what I've noticed in Furia is that a lot of damage comes from creatures. Removal, everything, it's all creature damage. And that spells in terms of removal haven't seen much play. And the reason for that is that creature because the game is so board centric where you need to be collecting mana from the wells, having a removal spell and not developing can be very harmful for you. In again, take for example Hearthstone. I'm sure many of you play it. If you're playing mage and your opponent's playing a swarm deck, just a lot of low health creatures, you don't mind spending your entire turn 7 just clearing the board with one flame strike, because in Hearthstone a lot of the clearing comes from spells, which means even if you don't establish a board, clearing your opponents is just as good. Whereas in Furia, unless you're establishing board and clearing, you will often be left behind because your opponent can use their other creatures to keep collecting, while now you have to reestablish your board, but you're one turn behind on creatures, as well as collecting from the wells. So having direct damage here is efficient direct damage, I mean, is very, very strong because essentially any bit of damage that you've negated from your creatures is basically healed. For example, you choking sands a Grim Guard that's right next to a Shaitan Demon. You've effectively given that Shaitan Demon 2 health, right? Because if you were to attack into it, your Shaitan Demon will be left as a 5/2. We're not going to talk about life totals here because like I said, we're going to be talking board centric. So choking sands itself is a very great card in that, like I said, it kind of pseudo gives your creatures health that otherwise they would take, allowing your Shane Demon to, make force out more trades. Same with Flameburst Cypher's Wrath, right? 2 mana, 3 mana, which means it can be played even on an empty board. And say, for example, your opponent and you are going toe to toe, and they finally set up a 3 mana 2/2 Spring Mochi, 3 mana 1/1 Lore Thief, whatever. You can Cypher's Wrath it, and now you have a 1 mana advantage above that. And that's very strong in this game because not a lot of damage comes from spells, like I said. So next, the last one would be overstated minions. Now there aren't exactly a whole lot of overstated minions. Most of them come with their fair share of drawbacks, or uh, yeah, just drawbacks. Some of them are kind of understated, but their ability makes them very, very strong. So number one, we have Crumbling Golem. The list isn't really in any order. It's just the order that I remember to put them in. So number one would be Crumbling Golem, a 5 mana 1 mountain 7/6. The stats on that alone are insane, forcing your opponent to have to create negative trades all the time. First of all, having an offensive stat distribution allows it to be very aggressive. Early game, your opponent's going to be playing creatures to try to slow you down, but having 6 health with 1 mountain, makes it very hard. So it makes it that even against another red, they would have to double flame burst to clear the golem, or they have to spend multiple turns setting up and trading to clear the golem, whether Grim Guards, Shitting Brutes, uh, any other meta red cards other than those two. And the next one, Underground Brigand, also another red card. So for this one, it's interesting in that it's very it's very fairly stated, 3 mana 2/3, but the ability is what makes it very strong. Gain 2 mana. So the card, even if it gets one attack off, it's a 1 mana 2/3, which is, already very valuable. But the biggest thing is that it sometimes forces your opponent to use hard removal. There have been a lot of times where I will play Underground Brigand, and my opponent would cast a Flame Burst instead of trading in order to save that 2 mana deficit. But in doing so, they've actually created a higher deficit in that not only have they traded a card, but they didn't come out on top, right? They traded 3 mana for a 3 mana card, but now that's also 3 less damage going to my face. That's 3 less damage going to my other creatures. So in the end, Underground Brigand, no matter how you play it, it will get value. Next one, Verduran Forest. It's like Crumbling Golem 2.0. Two forests, 6 mana, 7/7. Oh, I almost forgot. Right. So usually in card games, there's a formula for stat distribution. Unless they have very strong uh, gifts or last words or other abilities, usually it's the stats plus or minus one, depending on the ability. So what I've noticed in Furia most of all is that if it has a self-detrimental ability, it is usually the stats times 2 plus 1 or 2. Or if it has a ability that uh, can gain you stuff, it's a little bit understated in that, un in similar to Underground Brigand. 3 mana, 2/3, the stats are fair, a little bit on the low side, but that's how it works in this game. Now, Verduran Force is a straight up beast. 6 mana, 7/7 is a 2 times mana cost plus 2 with absolutely no drawbacks. And it has a very all around stat line. It's not like an 8/6 or a 9/5. It's a very uh, strong 7/7. 7 damage is enough to threaten, you know, basically any creature in the game. It's also tanky enough to force multiple trades. And another overstated minion I would consider would be Kaleem Sky Prodigy. Now, Kaleem, 5 mana, 3 mountains, 3/6. By that, it's not very good. But the reason why Kaleem is such a staple in almost every yellow deck, tempo, flying, it's even found in some archetypes of Rush, is that it has flying charge 2. But the biggest thing is that when Kaleem attacks an enemy god, you add a Kaleem's follower to your hand, which costs 0. Now, in a lot of yellow tempo and yellow flying decks, you have lands set up in the wells, which means anytime you attack with Kaleem Sky Prodigy, you can actually set down a Kaleem's follower inside the wells and double collect for 0 mana. 0 mana game 2 after you attack with Kaleem Sky Prodigy, as well as threatening another double collect on the next turn if your opponent doesn't clear. Not only that, it's very good for pushing damage as well, right? Say, for example, you're in a race with your opponent. Turn 1 of the race, you hit face for 3. You add your Kaleem's follower, hit for another 2, doing 5. Next turn, you hit with the Kaleem's follower, then hit with Kaleem. You get another Kaleem's follower. Now you hit for another 2. So that's 2 plus 2 plus 3, which is 7 damage plus the 5. That's 12 damage in 2 turns. And as any deck, I think it's very hard to come back after 12 damage in 2 turns. And the last one is the infamous Azure Skywhale. Now this one has, wow, so many community complaints. They say delete the card, rework Swallow, nerf the Skywhale, more lands, more mana, less stats. And to some degree, I agree with them because in a game like Furia, even soft removal is quite potent. Uh, Azure Skywhale is essentially a last nightmare that comes with a flying charge 3 body. Uh, it's very hard for your opponents to be removing a flying charge 3, regardless of stats, because most of the times it'll just be dashing through the battlefield to somewhere where your creatures can't reach while your opponents keep setting up other creatures. So, every time a Skywhale comes out, most people just assume that, that creature is gone and it can swallow any creature, your buffed Grim Guards, your buffed Shadim Brutes, your Verduran Force, everything gets swallowed. And the positive mana trade that comes out of it is absolutely insane. So for example, Azure Skywell, let's just say you swallow a Verduran Force. It's 6 mana, 6/6, flying charge 3, that destroys a 6 mana card. So essentially, you're playing 6 mana to not only destroy a 6 your opponent's 6 mana card, you're also getting a flying charge 3 out of it, which you can use in the late game to start pushing damage, which is absolutely insane. You can also play Krog, but no one plays him. So there are there's actually one more thing is that a lot of the broken OP cards actually ignore one fundamental game mechanic, right? Which is mana gain and fair stat distribution. But in Furia, where the game is centric around the board, cards that can completely ignore a board built up by you or your opponent is very potent in that it takes out one of the game's fundamental designs. And taking out part of the and ignoring part of the game's fundamental designs is what makes a deck very, very strong. And there are a lot of cards that do that, but I didn't really have the energy to, find all the pictures and put them all in. So I put it in very simple text. Every yellow card. That's it. Every yellow card. So what does this mean for competitive play? How would this affect the competitive zone and how future card creations go on? Number one, it creates a really repetitive gameplay. Playing in God rank, 90% of my matches are either against a whale deck or a type of ramp deck with green and blue, a yellow tempo. A lot of repetitive gameplay where you just end up playing against the same decks over and over, which actually leads to a very unfun time for both you and your opponent. Well, it might be fun for whoever's winning, but you get the point. Next one is that there's a lot less interaction in the game. As more and more cards get released, uh, I find that there's less and less interaction going on in the game. A lot of these cards, you do something on your turn, but it's such a huge tempo swing that your opponents really can't get back in. And people may argue that, it's a win condition, it's what helps you win the game, yes. But at the same time, in the case of Azure Skywill, you shouldn't be saying, GG, it's all over, or like starting to hover over the concede button, once you see it drop. Uh, that's also leads to my next point is that it really limits design space. Those cards there that have already existed, it's very hard to create new cards that don't power creep, right? Or you need to start setting in a standard rotation, like in all the major card games, Hearthstone, MTG, they all have their standard rotations to rotate old cards out of the meta. Now, Furia's card base isn't big enough for that type of action yet. So the best thing I guess the devs can do right now would be to consistently balance and patch cards. But in the case of Skyward and Frog Tosser, uh, those cards are very, how do you say, uninteractive. You do something in your turn that your opponent is forced to respond to. And yes, it's a tempo play. It's good to have some sort of uninteractivity in the game. But at the same time, if you're playing cards like Kalim's Prayer, there's nothing your opponent can do while you're just spamming Origin Monks, Kalim's followers, followed by, Kalim's Prayer like 3 turns in a row, and ultimately just winning because you could do a bunch of things while your opponent uh, doesn't have a chance to retaliate until their next turn. And summoning sickness and everything allowing you to get even more shots in. So that's essentially what happens with these considered OP cards. That's how I would classify OP cards and how I would categorize them. Um, and that's basically how they would affect competitive space and future card design. So that's my first video. I know it's a little bit rough on the rough on the edges. I stammer a bit, but hey, if you have any comments, suggestions, anything you like, you don't like, feel free to leave it in the comments or, send me a message on Discord and I'll be sure to read it and I'll try to, create better and better content in the future for you guys to enjoy. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye bye.